We had a wonderful time putting this series together. I think you'll find it a lot of fun and very interesting and enlightening. And I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, who is a colleague and friend of mine at Rutgers, Barry Qualls. Barry is the author of The Secular Pilgrims, the novel as Book of Life, and of articles and reviews on 19th century English literature and on the Bible and its literary impact. His teaching interests focus on Victorian literature and on biblical literatures. He teaches for us, but he is also our Vice President of Undergraduate Education at Rutgers, and he does both of those beautifully. His particular focus as a member of the Rutgers community has been on the ways graduate and undergraduate education work together constructively in a research university. He's also worked to establish closer working relationships between the state's public schools and its flagship public research university. I said he's a wonderful teacher. He's the winner of both the Sussman and the Faculty of Arts and Science Awards for Outstanding Teaching, the Douglas Medal for Service to Douglas College, our women's college at Rutgers, and in 2006 he was named New Jersey Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. And I guarantee you're going to have a wonderful experience listening to Barry talk about charwomen and home angels, industrialism, and Queen Victoria's England.
Well, I am glad that one's on. Okay, thanks. I am glad to be here. I think turn it down just a bit. Do you think it's my cell phone?
No, it's not the cell phone. No.
Try it again. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? It's not my cell phone. Well, I am glad to be here. I already have seen many people I have known before, and it's always good to see them again. But I could talk about Victorian England and plan to even at my funeral. I fell in love with Victorian literature when I was a small child in eastern Kentucky, and my brother and I used to have contests about how much Tennyson we could memorize. He, alas, preferred Edgar Allan Poe, but I did not. And then in the 9th grade, I read Thackeray's Vanity Fair, and as my mother said not too long, about 40 years later, it ruined my relationship to women forever. She was convinced that I thought only women should be as wicked and interesting as Becky Sharp. So she was right. But at any rate, I love talking about Victorian England, and I love talking about not only the Queen, but the literatures of Victorian England. I teach a 19th century British fiction, a big lecture course of about 100 people at Rutgers. And this term I'm teaching a wonderful course for senior seminar called The Domestic Epic, Little Dorrit and Middlemarch. One student said to me at the beginning of the term, "Is that all we're reading?" She said yesterday she was behind. I leave you to decide what she's discovering about novels that are 1,000 pages each. Now, the reason I wanted to talk tonight about Victorian charwomen and home angels is that it's very clear that when you learn about Victorian England, one of the things that you learn very rapidly is that the 19th century England was reshaped by industrialism. England became the greatest world power there had ever been, since Rome at least, and it made comparisons of itself with Rome. But because of the Industrial Revolution, because of what the Industrial Revolution made possible, what I want to talk about tonight is the way the Industrial Revolution entered ideas about the home, entered ideas about women, and produced a lot of imagery from the Queen on down about the nature of women and women's roles in the 19th century. I have put up here on the board 4 quotations to sort of set the stage, because one of the things that's to me most interesting is that from Wordsworth, and indeed way before, people were already talking about how industrialism had created a new urbanism, had ensured a kind of that huge expansion of cities, particularly those northern industrial cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, and what have you. And I've always thought that Wordsworth's preface, particularly since it's a preface to poetry where he defends his simple language versus the couplets of Pope and others, but I think a comment in the preface to poetry about contemporary England is worth noting. A multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion, to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. The most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place, and the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident, which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies. Now, that accumulation of human beings in cities is about the transformation of cities brought on by the Industrial Revolution. Marx and Engels particularly in his Condition of the Working Classes in Manchester in 1844, were fascinated, as was Emerson and any visitor to England, what they thought was the impact of modernity on 19th century England. Emerson came to look at Manchester. Engels and Marx came to look at Manchester as a kind of, if you will, as an example, but also as a kind of experiment in modernity. And of course, what they often found were deplorable social conditions, even amidst vast wealth, or the production of vast wealth, if you will. And one of the things that's most fascinating is the way that people who commented on this endlessly thought that the 19th century had the very idea of who the human, of what it was to be human, had changed. And Robert Owen, who is a utopian manufacturer, note that the general diffusion of manufacturers throughout a country generates a new character in its inhabitants. The manufacturing system has already so far extended its influence over the British Empire as to effect an essential change in the character of the people. Now, what that's really about is an apprehension that human beings packed together in cities are no longer one. The agrarian are no longer a part of the old England, Merry England, if you will, the agrarian world that Engels notes had been the 18th century heritage. A world, by the way, that you can find, with certainly, this is a crude overstatement, that you will still see very much in Jane Austen novels. But Owen's comment tells us something about the perception of a nation whose individuals have changed. And of course, the new wealth that came from industrialism produced a burgeoning middle class. Wordsworth's comments about the rapid communication of intelligence is really about the huge increase of publications, the number of newspapers coming, and he also talks about sickly and stupid German tragedies and all these silly novels that people are reading because they need outrageous stimulation. Now, there are even books in the 19th century, articles in the 19th century that said novels were ruining women's ability to have children because it made them lustful. I leave that to you. It hasn't been my experience. If you read that, I'm still looking forward. At any rate, the issue is, of course, is that the amount of absolute reading material available to people because of steam presses, the burgeoning, just explosion of literature, of reading matter of all levels. You will find social commentaries worrying that people, the middle classes are reading the same thing that maids in the kitchen are reading. Oh my goodness. The sense that there's a kind of democracy afoot, a kind of explosion of ideas that no one can control. And the issue of how you get people to read together, think together, concerned many, many Victorian critics. Now, the comment on all of this, I won't read the Karl Marx. I put Marx and Carlyle here since they're both speaking in the 1840s, though obviously Marx was not translated until much later. He wrote in German. Are really about what happened to the ideal of community when there is such a huge dependence of so many workers, of so many people working in factories, etc. We call it a society and go about professing openly the totalist separation. Our life is not a mutual helpfulness, but rather cloaked under due laws of war, named fair competition and so forth. It is a mutual hostility. We have profoundly forgotten everywhere that cash payment is not the sole relation of human beings. We think, nothing doubting, that it absolves and liquidates all engagements of man. Now, Marx says pretty much the same thing. And what I think it's important to notice is that they're talking about what a traditional order of relationship, however you want to define it, being replaced where your only connection is not human but through money. And one of the things that happened in the 19th century, of course, is the fact that you will find author after author, and novel after novel, trying to face the condition of England in question. I love to remind people that something that Raymond Williams, the great British humanist, historian, and cultural critic noted many years ago, that there are words that changed their meaning in the 19th century. One of them is industry. That is to say, in the early 19th century, the words industrial and industrious were pretty much synonymous. I would not walk in here and say to you, you look like a very industrial person, unless I was Dickens. That is to say, what Williams points out is that the words industrial and industrious parted ways. Industrial referring not to human aspects, but to material aspects of factories, and industrious suggesting hard-working people. He also talks about the word class as changing its meaning as well. England had always had ranks, but the idea of social class became a dominant idea. And if you know Dickens' Great Expectations, the little boy very early learns that he does not know the difference between a knave and a jack in a deck of cards. That is to say, he doesn't know that a knave is a proper word for cards, that card, and that jack is a lower class term. And when the girl Estella says to him, look at your hands, she means that his hands are tanned, which means he works outside. So those kind of social markers became increasingly important. They're wonderful books. I wish I had time to give a lecture on Mrs. Bignon's book of household management. It tells you not only how to cook a quadruped, but it also, and it's the best-selling, it's still in print, book in the 19th century, tells you how to visit your neighbors. You thought you knew. It tells you how to visit your neighbors. It also tells you how to hire a wet nurse. It tells you how, in some ways, to prove that you're a member of the middle class. It's the joy of sex called the joy of class. And it's very interesting. Now, I'm going to come back to these issues of industrialism and women, but I want to go to two representations of the Queen to give a context of the things that I want us to think about this evening. I love this painting. This is a painting of Queen Victoria. She had, as you know, a good number of children, 9, I think, and this is called The 1st of May, and that's her son Arthur. The man on the left, and the man behind her is Prince Albert, and the man on the left is the Duke of Wellington bringing a gift to the young baby. Now, this painting is one of the most politically rich paintings I know of Queen Victoria, and she did indeed tell the artist, please remember the wonderful colors of Veronese. She also recommended that the artist think about the Madonna and child paintings of the Renaissance. But what I find so fascinating in this, all the lighting of painting, I mean, here is the greatest industrial country in the world in the 50s and 60s and thereafter. The light of the painting is focused on the woman and child. You'll notice that the painting is to suggest that the Duke of Wellington is the wise man, coming to guests. The wise man coming bearing gifts to the new, quote, child, not accidentally named Arthur, I like to think. What I also want you to notice is what's over here. This is Hyde Park, and that's the Crystal Palace. And the painting here, the prince is looking right out at his great achievement, which is to say the first World's Fair in 1851, the display of all the nations in Hyde Park, the Crystal Palace. It was built of glass. He went with Majesty and her husband and went there more than once. This was one of those great social experiments. People worried that bringing the lower classes into London in such numbers would cause riot. Well, the lower classes didn't riot any more than the Queen's children did. That's not an ironic comment. But what I think is interesting about this painting, it's got up as a domestic painting, but it connects the royal family with Christian iconography and the mother and child. It emphasizes that the center of England's greatness is still based in the home, and it also reminds people very slyly the world of men, the world of production, the world of material culture. Now, look at the next one. This one is striking. This is called The Secret of England's Greatness. Again, the Queen in white. You have an African chieftain bowing. She's giving him a Bible. Do I need to say more? That is to say, is the secret of England's greatness the Bible? Christianity? Is it the connection of the Bible and the Queen? The fact that the Queen is herself represents the spiritual ideas of the home in the nation? And again, it's a total political painting. But notice the way that the Bible and the Queen, the man is bowing, but is he bowing to power or to God? And you'll notice how the painting very slyly suggests that the power of the monarchy, the power of the home, is also what England is giving to the world. A couple of quotations. I don't really like this painting, but anyhow, I found it. The family is the center and the archetype of the state, and the happiness and goodness of society are always in a very great degree dependent upon the purity of domestic life. That is a great historian, William Lecky. And then Sarah Ellis. Sarah Ellis is one of these people who wrote 4 different conduct books with advice. The women of England, the mothers of England, the girls of England, and the daughters of England. And believe me, they were bestsellers, the late 30s, early 40s. How intimate is the connection between the women of England and the moral character maintained by their country in the scale of nations? And I might add that a comment about that is not only to suggest the power of women, but also, of course, to celebrate the fact that they do not go out into that industrial world. That their power comes from the fact that they being domestic, being focused on the domestic, they ensure the morals, that England is at the top of the moral scale of nations. Now, this kind of ideology, which is very familiar now, in which people talk about angels in the house and all of that, but in fact, it was an ideology that developed out, very much out of the fact of what of the ways industrialism brought such changes to English life and English cities. Here's a painting called The Woman-Efficient Companion of Manhood. Woman embodies our highest ideas of purity and refinement. It is certainly curious that one of the earliest results of an increased feminine influence in our literature should be a display of what in women is most unfeminine. One is reminded of the famous fact that the first record of feminine conduct in the world's history is unfeminine. Eve is said to have eaten the apple in a masculine lust of power, to be as the gods. That's right. And Adam in a feminine weakness and affection for the mate who offered it. Woman peculiarly represents the private life of the race. Her ascendancy in literature must mean the ascendancy of domestic ideas and the assertion of the individual, not as a hero, but as a family man. Not as a heroine, but an angel in the house. The individual as a great public character withers. The individual as a member of society in all of his private relations grows in importance. Now, I like to show that because not only that you'll see the painting, Woman's Mission, Companion of Manhood. We don't know what's in the letter he's just read, but you'll notice again that the notion of what women stand for, the private life of the race, purity and refinement. Now, none of this is news, but one of the things that Dallas also says in this book is that you cannot have women heroines in fiction because a fiction needs a heroine who's active. And the only way you can have active women is if they commit bigamy or go off and do other things in Europe. But if you ever wonder why Victorian novels are so centered around women characters, and why the ideal of domestic realism, Dickens's novels, Do I Need to Say More Than Little Dorrit, or Oliver Twist with the woman where the birds dance around her head, and he talks about she's an angel come to earth. I mean, these kind of images are part of the culture's need for a kind of unchanging, a kind of total belief that there's something not being attacked by modernity. And particularly when not only that you have the changing nature of cities, but you also had Darwin in 1859, you had endless discussions of whether the Bible was accurate in its details. Could you get that many Hebrews in this size of a tent? You know, that may strike us as bizarre. But again, it suggests to find a mistake in the Bible is to somehow call it into question as the Word of God. These kind of issues came up constantly in the 19th century. And last, the last of England. In the 1850s in particular, there were huge immigrations out of England. The Hungry 40s had produced huge social problems. And one of the solutions for many people was to go to Australia or Canada or what have you. And I love this painting. You'll notice that you have this sort of rough sea around them. But notice the way the painting is done. Again, the way the woman's bonnet suggests a halo. And notice the child, the little hands peeping from under the cloak here. That is to say, a couple who in some ways, who've been severed from the English world they thought to inhabit. And this comment from Peter Gaskell, I made a mistake, I should say 1836. The disruptions of the ties of home is one of the most fatal consequences of the factory system. Now, I wanted to go to that comment because the notion that the factory system has disrupted the ties of home was a preoccupation of the 19th century. The notion that somehow home had been ruined, lower class women went into the streets to work, that somehow the whole sense of social roles had been altered permanently was a constant. Let me just read you something for a moment from a wonderful social commentator named William R. Gregg. Those who have witnessed the filthy and crowded cottage, where the sexes are in close and perilous contact night and day, where decency is difficult and comfort impossible, in breaking down the barriers of modesty, in obliterating all the sweet and saving attractions of a home, in weakening and desecrating all domestic ties, in brutalizing the manners and lowering the desires, and those, on the other hand, who trace the influence of an ample, well-ordered, and wholesome dwelling in eliciting all that is good, in cultivating all that is gentle and decorous, in fortifying all that is strong. These will feel with us that the estimate of the good, which by attention and assistance the great employer of labor is able to accomplish, can scarcely be too high. And what he's recommending in this book called Employers and Employed, he's recommended that employers build houses that people actually live in, not the kind of filthy cottages that were polluted with sewage, wet, diseased, rats, etc. Mrs. Gaskell wrote a wonderful book called Mary Barton in 1848. Dickens, of course, wrote Hard Times. there are a lot of novels that wanted to look at the condition of England in question. And one of the things that Gaskell does is to talk about in that novel, she shows you that from the point of view of the workers, how filthy the houses are. And she keeps saying, in good times, there's order and cleanliness. In bad times, they live in filth. And if a man's home is his castle, one of the proverbs that the English love to this day, if a man's home is his castle, the castle was rather severely stained, indeed infected by modernity through the factory system. And the comment from Gaskell in 1836 suggests, of course, that people from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution were very worried about the nature of how it changed human roles and brought contact between the sexes, etc., that made a stable home life. You'll notice that what I just read that talks about order and harmony, that kind of life, well nigh impossible. These are ideas that we're not surprised by, perhaps, but for the 19th century mind, they were ideas of some terror. This is Gaskell in the preface to Mary Barton notes that the filth, hunger, disease in Manchester, England, which the wealthy, factory-owning classes seem not to notice, is producing the same conditions that produced revolution in France. And I think it's possibly arguable that the most important thing that happened in England in the 19th century was the French Revolution in 1789, a revolution that continued about every 20 years. The French had lots of revolutions, 1828, 1848, 1870. That is to say, the revolutions in France that kept reminding people that the order established by God is not real. That the divine right of kings, the great chain of being, however you want to see it, is a fiction of the ruling classes, and that people can throw it out. You might remember that England never had a revolution in the 19th century. In the 1830s, votes were given to people who owned, paid, I think, I've forgotten now, but about 10 pounds a year taxes on property. In other words, celebration of property. The votes began to go to the lower class, to the working class, upper levels of the working classes and middle classes, and more representation was given to the towns, the big towns in the north, beginning in the 1830s. So there were constant changes of law, changes of laws that kept the revolution at bay. And I want to give you some statistics from factory acts of the 1830s and 40s that will tell you something about the conditions of children and women who worked in these factories. In 1833, they passed a new law saying that children from the age of 13 to 18 could work at most a 12-hour day, and that children from 19 to 13 could work at most a 9-hour day. In 1842, in the Mines Act, the law said that women and girls and boys under 10 could only work 12-hour days. In 1844, the Factory Act said that women and children from the ages of 13 to 18 could only work 12-hour days. In 1847, a new act said women and children under 18 could work at most a 58-hour work week. Now, what I'm wanting to suggest in those kind of figures is that those figures give us a sense that that labor is cheap. It also gives us a sense of why Dickens in Hard Times says that the masters of industry are more comfortable if they can only think of the people who work in their factories, if they can only think of them as hands and stomachs and not as human beings. The great Dickens satires come straight out of that. And I want to read you just one moment Dickens' description of an industrial city in the mid-19th century. Hopetown was a triumph of fact. It had no greater taint of fancy in it than Mrs. Gradgrind, she's the wife of the school teacher herself. Let us strike the keynote. Hopetown before pursuing our tune. It was a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of buildings full of windows where there was a rattling and trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. Do you love that? Steam engine, the head of an elephant in a state of madness, melancholy. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours with the same sound upon the same pavements to do the same work, and whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the companion, the counterpart of the last and next. You saw nothing in Copeland town but what was severely workful. If the members of a religious persuasion built a chapel there, as the members of 18 religious persuasions had done, they made it a pious warehouse of red brick, with sometimes, but this is only in the ornamental examples, a bell in the bird cage on top of it. The solitary exception was the new church. He goes on, fact, 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 everywhere in the material aspect of the town. Fact, 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 everywhere in the immaterial. The Machokum Child School, isn't that a great name for a school? Machokum Child. The Machokum Child School was all fact, and the School of Design was all fact, and the relations between master and man was all fact. And everything was fact between the lying-in hospital and the cemetery. And what you wouldn't state in figures or show to be purchasable in the cheapest market and sellable in the dearest was not and never would be world without end, amen. You know, we should skip lectures and just read Dickens out loud. It's the most remarkable thing in the world. I have a great student in my class who's an actor, and I always give him the passages that have dialect because he's so good at it. And, you know, one day I forgot what the class was about. I just had to keep on reading. A student did say at the end, were we supposed to do this today? I thought, oh, no. But Dickens, actually, of course, many people have said Dickens's ways of writing come from his experience of life only in a city, that the caricatures of Dickens' novels are about people who must perforce live on the surfaces of their skin in a material world without souls. That's an exaggeration, but it's one way of thinking about it. So what I want to make clear, and I'm going to show you some really wonderful paintings in a minute, is that the notion of industrialism disturbed almost every aspect of how people thought of the home life, of the roles of women, and sometimes men in culture. It changed the nature of novels. It brought new subjects into novels that had not hitherto been. Jane Austen doesn't write about industrialism. Dickens almost leaves no industry out of his novels. It's a fascinating thing. But at the same time, you will notice throughout the period that people are constantly worrying about the effect of the industrial, the effect of a material world of both splendor and savage torpor, to quote Wordsworth, splendor and ugliness and disease that some of the cities. Ingalls notices in his book on Manchester that you always see the great shops and streets when you go through a city. You don't see the slums that produce the wealth in the back. And one of the things that you'll notice in many Victorian paintings, and I'm going to show you some in a minute, is the way Victorian painters dealt with both life in the streets, but also, tellingly, with the effect of the industrialism on the home. The sense, as Gaskell puts it here, that the disruptions of the ties of home. Now, a casual ward was a place where you went, but it's sort of like what we would call soup kitchens now. A casual ward was a place where you would go if you were in the streets at night and needed to try to get some food or some shelter in the evenings. What I love about this painting is you'll notice a child and a father. You'll notice the little family group over here. You notice this woman with the child, you see the foot there, carrying a child with a little girl by her. What I'm getting at here is here's a painting that depends for its effects on our sense of children and women trapped in the streets with no place to go except for casual work. The painting is, you even have wealthier people, some of the people in top hats over here. The sense of a world that without money, without a position, without the ability to purchase food or shelter, and this is what it's come to. This is called Hard Times. It's much later, 1885. But what this, again, you'll notice that Hard Times is not about, it's not just looking at men in factories or women and children in factories. It's also suggesting, particularly right here, notice the separation of the father and the wife and the children. It's suggesting, of course, with the road here that goes off to nowhere, the destitution of families thrown out of work, whose only subsistence is factories. I would point out to you, by the way, that the average lifespan of working class people in the 19th century was generally under 30. You and I think about lifespans of the Victorians that, you know, Queen Victoria lived forever, still alive. Tennyson, of course, lived to a grand old age, Carlyle and many others. But in fact, even middle-class people, particularly women, I'll come back to that, the life expectancy would have been in the 40s. We are used to thinking Victorians living forever, particularly when we see downstairs, or its new modern equivalent, Downton Abbey or something. But in fact, the birth rates, particularly for women in childbirth, were very, very difficult. Childbirth, there were so many deaths of childbirth. It was something that, and the Victorians were much more aware of death than we are, because of course there were very conventions of mourning in the wearing of black for a certain period, and then gray, etc. So you would have been very much more aware of death is always in front of you. But I think this picture and the previous one say a lot about the nature of Victorian life. Now, I want to say something about the attractions of a world outside of a home. I'm about to show you 3 paintings called Past and Present by Augustus A. These paintings are from about a middle-class family, but what makes these paintings fascinating to me, it suggests a world, and I'll tell you how you read this painting in a minute, where one of the reviews said this. This is a painting about a woman who read the Rome novels and fell. Really, I don't make any of these things up. But it's a triptych, and let me show you the 3 paintings, and then I'll come back to the first one. Now, I wish we could see this better. This, in the mirror, which is over the fireplace, you can see the door of the house is open. I have to say, Victorians do things, painters, and also novelists do things I always say students don't do. Never think of symbols. Well, Victorian paintings are lower with them. You have an open door, and the woman lying down here, obviously facing the open door. Notice how her bracelet suggests handcuffs. Notice, too, that the apple, excuse me, my fingers wandered. We know where the apple comes from. That is to say, the husband evidently has gotten a letter telling of the wife's infidelities. And so the center of the disruption of the home comes from her desire to go outdoors, to leave the domestic sanctities of the house. More interestingly about this, and then you have her daughters. They're building a house of cards. But, we can't see it here, but they're building a house of cards on top of 2 novels by Balzac. Now, folks, when you're reading Victorian novels, and anybody picks up a French novel, if you ever wanted a code for sex, it's a French novel. And Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair says, "Vive Napoleon." And she herself picks up a French novel. Well, I won't go far. Even in Trollope, Bishop Grantley reads Rabelais and keeps it locked in his desk. We know that he's occasionally guilty of a lubricious fault. So anyhow, these girls are building a house of cards. You'll notice there's an apple here. Over here, there's a picture, we can't see it easily here. There's a picture of the mother on this side right here. And above her is a painting of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Over here is a painting of the husband. And above him is a ship amidst storm. Do I need to tell you I won't even talk about the meanings of those. The painting is a rich one. The way everything is arranged, I'll talk some more in a minute. But the woman hiding in, her face on the floor, the door open, the apple, the bracelets that look like handcuffs, tells you a lot. This is the results. This is the present. The daughters have no parents now. They're living in a bedstead somewhere, and they're looking out the window. One of them, both of them, alone. In the description that accompanied the painting, it says they're now orphans. Well, they're not, because the mother is still alive. But the mother, will notice that this painting and this one, the daughters and the mother have the moon outside the window, both of them. But the mother is here. She's had a baby. Notice the feet. But there's no halo around her, as we've seen in some of those other babies. And on the wall over here are advertisements about cheap fares to France. Did that happen to you in Paris? No. But I find this painting fascinating because paintings like, Victorians were fascinated with fallen women. But paintings like this, and there are vast numbers of prostitute paintings, are about people who sense, Charlotte Bronte once said that Milton knew only two kinds of women, whores and angels. And he got both images from his maid. But in fact, one of the things that paintings like this produce is a sense of a culture somehow in the throes of a dislocation where traditional roles are being lost. In Mrs. Gaskell's Mary Barton, and I was going to read it, but I won't, one of the main figures in this novel is a prostitute. She's a member of the main family of the novel. She's a member of the main family of the novel. I've lost my slideshow. She's a member of the main family of the novel. Hold on just a minute, folks. There it is. She's a member of the main family of the novel, but she wants to rise. She's an industrial city, and she thinks if she could only marry a middle-class man or a soldier, she could rise in society. It's the great Gatsby story told through a woman's eyes. What is upper mobility? And of course, she has a baby. The husband no longer is there, or they never marry. And the next thing you know, she's a prostitute in order to earn money for the child to have food. And the presence of fallen women in these novels, there's a great moment in a Dickens novel, Little Dorrit, but there's a great moment in a Dickens novel, Little Dorrit, where the heroine, who's 21, although it's called Little Dorrit, is outside in the streets very late at night. She gets locked out of the place where they live in debtor's prison, with her father. And a prostitute comes up and thinks she's a child and says, "Let me touch you." And she gets close and says, "But you're a woman, why are you in the street?" And the Little Dorrit says, very movingly, I think, "Oh, think of me as a child if it helps." That is to say, it says that to touch purity is to touch the image of the home. And Amy Dorrit is both childlike and also caring. Now, the person in this novel, Mary Barton, Esther, she has wanted so badly to rise in class status, like given great expectations. She's a woman, and the only way she can do it is to marry a middle-class man. Marrying up, traditional story of many novels. but it's a telling one in this one because marrying up has condemned her. Great Expectations, even Pip, who wants so badly to rise in class and never call the knave a jack again. Even Pip, who wants the blonde-haired woman that Lake Jay Gatsby does, but even he is a disappointed man by the end of the novel. When he learns that what is Great Expectations? Is how you sever all the ties to the past, which Dickens represents as the country, and you go to the city. And the cities are the place of material splendor, but for Great Expectations, even the boy arrives in the city, and what does he find? Smithfield Prison, and the place of Spitalfields, the place where the stockyards, where meat is prepared. So he goes to the ugliest, dirtiest part of London. That's mostly what we see there. Last two paintings, and I will be quiet. Now, I love these paintings because these paintings are done by Holman. I didn't have enough room to put the things. These are done by Holman Hunt in the early 1850s. And they were exhibited first as one as a response to the other. Hunt said, this one is called The Light of the World. It's one of the most famous paintings of the 19th century. I'll tell you an anecdote. It went on tour after in England. It was published in line drawings all over the world. It went on tour to Australia and then to New York. People lined up, huge crowds to see it. The Light of the World is, of course, based on a biblical story from the Gospels about Christ knocking at the door and asking to come into the heart. And so here you'll notice the door is rusty, full of the plants have grown all over it, suggesting that the human heart is totally closed to the Gospels. This is its companion piece. It's called The Awakening Conscience. And Hunt himself said that he saw this painting as a secular response, to a secular representation of the same thing that the obviously Christian painting had to say. And I want to just give you, I don't have enough time to do all of this, but let me just say some things about this painting. This woman is clearly no woman in the 19th century received a man in her white street clothes. You'll notice that she has rings on every finger except her wedding ring, big finger. I'll leave that for you to imagine. You'll notice that she's a kept woman. Here's a young man. I won't talk about the way he looks. Here's a big mirror, and you'll notice that she's looking out of doors. Down here is a cat with a mouse half eaten, suggesting that the man and the cat have something in common in their instincts. I won't comment on that. But what else is interesting, on the table right over here, there's a book on handwriting, which is to suggest that she was a young woman who's learning how to be a middle-class woman worthy of a gentleman. On the piano is a song from Thomas More called Off on These Stilly Nights, which is a song about memories of the past. On the floor is another song based on Tennyson's poem Tears, Idle Tears, about the days that are no more. The suggestion here is that somehow, looking out into the freshness of the natural world, she sees how far away her life is from her essence as a woman. And over here we have Cupids on the piano. The painting's loaded with stuff. A glove on the floor here, a kid glove, suggesting, of course, that she will be cast off like old gloves by this man. Or also suggesting, some people say, that in those days kid gloves couldn't be cleaned. I'll leave that to you. But the point is, the reason that he wanted these seen as companion pieces is that there's so much wealth. And John Ruskin, the great social and art critic, said there's so much veneer in this painting that wealth absolutely stinks. But you'll notice the sense that she's been lighted by the natural world, and somehow she has seen that in nature is something about a purity that she's left behind. So the idea of the awakening conscience is the idea that somehow that kind of world will give her the same illumination as a sense of Christ. Now, it's not far-fetched, as I hope I've suggested, to say that it's not far-fetched to see paintings like this coming out of the Industrial Revolution. They come out because there is so much wealth. There is so much wealth in mid-century and late-century England. There is so much possibilities of rising in class. There's also a sense that you can buy almost anything. You can conquer the world. That painting of Queen Victoria the Chieftain is about the British Empire. It's about which spread over the world in the 19th century, a very small country. But it's also about a sense of if you have a culture that wants to put prostitutes in novels, prostitutes on paintings, even though one of these suggested, I'll say something else about this one in a minute, one of these suggested that, one critic said this painting was too impure to be shown. But another one suggested that this was a perverse parody of the great Van Eyck painting on the Arnolfini marriage, because this is about the pollution of marriage. Whatever it is, what you're looking at here is a result of vast wealth, is a result of the breakdown of traditions that money made possible. New wealth, new people controlling wealth. I went to see The Social Network and thought, my God, these people are 25 years old and they're billionaires. And they have no moral sense. Well, you know, that might be a crazy reaction or not, but what you're seeing here is also wealth everywhere, and a country in the throes of social change. And novelists like Dickens or Mrs. Gaskell or later George Eliot determined to address what community means in a country where, as George Eliot said, since yesterday, as George Eliot, a character Bill Marsh says, since yesterday, a century has passed away. Thank you very much. I'm happy to ask as many questions as I have, and there are people in this room who know more than I do, whom I will call on. Yes?
I guess, how much of this is actually a reflection of life having been really better for the lower classes before? I mean, are these people that suddenly become aware of the lower classes because they're in their midst? I can't believe feudalism was really better.
Well, you know, even Marx makes that comment on feudalism. And one of the things I would remind you, I mentioned the Prince Arthur's name. You know, Victorian medievalism, which we have an expert on in this room, Victorianism is fascinating. The Houses of Parliament were built in the 1830s and 40s to remind you of the Middle Ages. There are gorgeous churches all over England built in the 1800s to look like medieval churches and cathedrals, because that was thought as a kind of organic whole period. The constant nostalgia for pre-industrial England is everywhere, even in George Eliot. What is Silas Marner? It takes place, as she puts it, at the beginning, they're in an ugly town with a jail and a factory. But the main part of Silas Marner, which at least I read in the 9th grade years ago, the main part of Silas Marner takes place in a town called Merry, England. And no, that's not the name of the town, it's Raveloe. She talks about it as a place of Merry, England. That is to say, there was always a nostalgia, even a critical nostalgia, for a past. The line in George Eliot about since yesterday a century has passed away is a line about people's sense that change is so all around them. Almost any critic you'll read, Carlyle, past and present. The present opens in a workhouse with starving workers. The past is centered around a medieval monastery. But Carlyle is not nostalgic. His images of the modernity are people, as he puts it, sitting each in his ice palace, making gestures that the person in the other ice palace could never interpret. And so there is a in some ways, the songs of the piano about the past and the wonders of memory are about a world of purity and innocence. Whether they ever existed, I leave to you. But in fact, what industrialism did is that it changed the very landscape of England. Carlyle makes a great comment that the streams are too impure for the piscatory otters, which he means fish, to swim in. And the pollution, none of us can imagine the smells of London in the 19th century. These slops that were thrown in the middle of the streets, the fecal material that was in the middle of the streets. Don't forget, London fogs and things came out of a huge pollution. And there wasn't even underground real sewage system early on. So you've got, I forgot the date, but the point is, you've got a world that has changed so vastly. And when you go to these big towns like Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds, they're totally built around, centered on factories and by the new wealth of their new mansions. And Gaskell, and Mrs. Gaskell and Mary Barton points out that poor see people walking through the streets, selling, moving farther and farther out of town to fancy houses and think, well, I made their wealth, why am I starving? Actually, let me read you something here. This is a man going to get medicine for families in a real hovel who are starving. It is a pretty sight to walk through a street with lighted shops. The gas is so brilliant, the display of goods so much more vividly shown than by day, and of all shops a druggist looks the most like the tales of our childhood, from Aladdin's garden of enchanted fruits to the charming Rosamond with her purple jar. None of us would say that at the right age. At any rate, no such association had Barton. Yet he felt the contrast between the well-filled, well-lighted shops and the dim, gloomy cellar, and it made him moody that such contrast should exist. They are the mysterious problem of life to more than him. He wondered if any in all the hurrying crowd had come from such a house of mourning. He's just left a poor house where their 2 children also have died. He thought they all looked joyous, and he was angry with them. But he could not, you cannot, read the lot of those who daily pass you by in the street. How do you know the wild romances of their lives? The trials, the temptations they are even now enduring, resisting, sinking under. You may be elbowed one instant by the girl desperate in her abandonment, a prostitute, laughing in mad merriment with her outward gesture while her soul is longing for death, and bringing itself to think of the cold flowing river as the only mercy of God remaining to her. You may pass the criminal, and she goes on. Errands of mercy, errands of sin. Did you ever think where all the thousands of people you daily meet are bound? Barton's was an errand of mercy, but the thoughts of his heart were touched by sin, by bitter hatred of the happy, whom he for the time confounded with the selfish. Now she has a problem because she doesn't want to suggest, she keeps saying, well, the wealthy would have, or just ignorant, they would do something. But of course, she also, as she says in the preface, I wrote to speak for people who have no voice or power to speak for themselves. And it opens, interestingly, in a country party with factory workers out in a park outside the city. That is to say, in a world elsewhere for the city. So, yes.
So I'm trying to put this in a historical context, including the previous question. And I'm recollecting the sense of progress that it felt.
Oh, they were believed in progress.
But it's also then hard to imagine somebody voluntarily leaving their job on the farm to go to work in a smaller one of these cities. So, and then I'm thinking, well, Malthus, I think, was about 1802. So
right.
Is this whole process then propelled by population pressure?
There's a huge population pressure. But according to Ingalls in the condition of the working class in Manchester, people wanted to see that 18th century world as pastoral. Ingalls, of course, saw that the dependence on the person who owned the land on which you labored and who could command a certain part of the produce you raised, etc., as a part of another kind of slavery. But when Ingalls says that the industrialism tore asunder the natural relations that bound human beings together, even he is acknowledging a seismic shift in the nature of the way human beings relate to each other. I'm not answering your question directly. There were lots of pressures, but also people went to the cities for the reasons that Jane Gatsby goes to the city in some ways, the sense of the city as a place of not only a sign of human progress, but where the possibilities of rising, because you can make money through work, is possible. The problem came, of course, when there were, particularly in the hungry 1840s, when there were endless, when there was a lot of issues in Europe that people weren't buying cloth and other produce, and people were being constantly put out of work. The hungry 40s was a very difficult time in England. There was a movement called Chartism, where a huge group of over 3 million workers signed petitions as in Parliament to confront the issues that were killing so many people in starvation, and the Parliament repeatedly rejected these petitions. There's a great moment in Gaskell's novel where people come back who've gone to London about the charter to support the charter, and the man comes back and says what happened there is unspeakable, and that his failure to tell a story of politics is replaced by another story of a man who goes to London some years earlier because his daughter and son-in-law had died in the city of diphtheria, forgot the disease, I think diphtheria, and he goes to get his granddaughter and raise her, bring her to Manchester to raise. So it's very complicated. Malthus, Adam Smith, all of this kind of social economy, economic theories. Carlyle and Dickens both inveigh against those kind of theories because they think they reduce human beings to figures. But in fact, the sense of the past is at once a place of organic wholeness that cannot come again because of the coming of industrialism. Yes, thanks.
I'm struck by the images of literary and paintings of women as either innocent victims or as sinners, and that probably a lot of these depictions are based on a desire to dramatize the vulnerability of the domestic woman, but also how much of these are reactions to a nascent women's rights movement.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer that question straightforward, but let me say what Victoria said about women's rights. She said women should not be trying to think of politics. When her husband came home at the end of the day, politics had made his gentleness certainly more stringent than she was used to, and that women, their jobs were to support and succor men, and women in politics would automatically lose that humility that made them good. Now, Victoria was as interested in politics as anybody, if you've ever read her letters to her daughters or what have you, particularly the daughter who was a German empress. Victoria is a very smart woman, by the way, a very interesting person to letters to read. But to go back to the question that you just asked, is to go back to this, there was a nascent women's movement. But it really came later in the century, although by 1848, during the period of all the hungry 40s, Jane Eyre. And what does she say? Not only, reader, I married him, but she also says, women feel as men do, and people do not know that there are revolutions in women's hearts that are as dangerous as revolutions in the world. There's a great novel that very few people know about by, it's called The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury. And it's also written appeared the same year as Jane Eyre. She also takes up these issues of what it means to be a woman. And the half-sisters, one of them is the child of an Englishman and his wife. The other is one of his wild oats sowed in Italy. Of course, they always have them abroad. And so his wife, the woman he loved in Italy, and her daughter brings the mother to London because they're starving in Italy, brings her to England, to London, I think, to find the father who's already dead. So the woman goes on, the Italian girl goes on the stage. And I warn y'all, a woman on the stage, ooh. But the novel is at some pains to protect her reputation for 400 pages. I should tell you, there's a wonderful, this is totally off the subject, but not totally. There's a wonderful novel by a sensation novelist, Elizabeth Braddon, called The Doctor's Wife. It was her effort to rewrite Madame Bovary for an English audience. Go get it. The Doctor's Wife. 400, Madame Bovary, married on page 1, flirting with men on page 10, having affairs on page 50. This does not happen in British novels. In the version that Mrs. Braddon wrote for the public, 400 and some pages, there may be flirtations, but there is no horizontal doings. My grammar went on that one. That is to say, it's a fascinating sense of the English versus the French. And indeed, one of the critics of Charlotte Bronte said, a French critic wrote, why is it that English novels end in marriage? In France, that's where we begin our novels. That's when we think life gets interesting. The British seem to think all the interest of life is gone once you're married. So, I love these anecdotes. I'm a storehouse of anecdotes. Not information, anecdotes. But in fact, the question that you just asked, there was a nascent, the constant attention to women's movement. Also much concern, even George Eliot, of all people, I think she gave 10 or 15 pounds to some women's group, but she was very uneasy about it. She said that the fact that women could become mothers was a different constitution about their role in the world. And one of the greatest of all characters in George Eliot, I think, is in her last novel, Daniel Deronda, often called the Jewish novel. Brilliant novel, not as much read as Middlemarch, but there's a character in there who is the hero's mother. She only has 2 chapters. It's like a mezzo-soprano coming in at the end of a Verdi opera to stop it all. But she has 2 chapters, and one of the things she says, you can never imagine the slavery of being born female when you have the power of genius in you. And this is 1876 or so. Now that's a great remark. But it also tells you the way people thought about. I mean, the princess comes in. She's Jewish, but she comes in. She arranged for her son to be raised by an Englishman because she wanted him to be free to choose. She thought she had, as a female, as a Jewish female, she was a product, enclosed in traditions that she would never have the power to choose. She is not an actress. And the son keeps thinking. She says to her son, "You're disappointed. I cannot perform the role of mother, and I never have." Now that's tough for a Victorian audience. She gets 2 chapters, but I think they're the greatest chapters of George Eliot myself. But I also think that they remind us that the issue of women's freedoms and what women could do in the streets are very difficult in my opinion. I mentioned sensation novels. One critic said women should not be allowed to read these books because they would cause them to menstruate. And another critic said, when women began to ride bicycles, there were actually discussions in Parliament whether there should be laws because bicycles, for some people, would prevent women from getting pregnant. Our forebears, one of I'm so Victorian, but it's a complicated issue. And don't forget the English right to vote came after this country, I think, to look that up. Other questions?
This is the last one.
Last one. Somebody asked a question. Yes, thank you.
What is the audience for the pictures that you showed? Sort of the people they painted?
They were painted for the middle classes. They were often bought, particularly by industrialists. If you've ever been to the museum at the state of Delaware, the great museum down there has one of the best collections of Victorian paintings in the world, certainly in this country, because the DuPonts bought most of them. And captains of industry, the new wealth, bought most of these paintings. Victorian paintings, the greatest collection of Victorian paintings now in private hands is, by the way, owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. They are, of course, great collections of the Tate in the art galleries in Manchester, Leeds, Lady Lever Art Gallery up there, Birmingham. These were very popular with middle classes. And the reason these paintings were so popular, Augustus A, past and present, is an exception because of its subject matter a bit. The reason these paintings were so popular is because they're narratives. They tell a story. They're like novels. They tell you a story in picture form. And Victorians love narrative paintings. And the paintings I showed you of the Queen, that's a royal family that knows exactly how to reclaim the territory of moral leadership that matches the ambitions of the middle-class power. Because the royal family, nobody would have ever thought that Victoria's throne would last. The family, after all, if you know much about George III or George IV, you certainly would not think that the monarchs could last in London and England. And there's Victoria, and they were very, very good at really setting themselves at the center of the ambitions, moral and spiritual and material, of the middle classes. That's one of the reasons the monarchy lasted so long. She nearly capsized it by the fact that when Albert died, she went into seclusion for so many years. And there was a lot of public dissent over the widow of Windsor. It wasn't Judy Dench. In the early part, Albert was brilliant about the, shall we say, I wouldn't say merchandising of the royal family, but about the depiction, about giving it a new iconic meaning. So, thank you very much.